What is going on, guys? We are back here with another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where we take a look at the Magic Online results over the weekend for the Modern, Pioneer, and Standard formats. Sometimes we'll take a look at some paper events, if available, which, spoiler alert, there was a big paper event this weekend. And we take a look at the top 32 metagame breakdowns. Combine, take a look and see what the metagame looks like this week compared to what it was last week. And at the very end of each individual format, we're going to take a look through the top 32 and see if we can find some spicy deck lists. And I have heard your comments and feedback over the past couple of weeks, and I've seen a lot of people maybe asking for some of the deck lists that are maybe doing a bit better. And I started that a little bit last week with the Esper Gorios, so I'm going to try to incorporate a couple more maybe like more popular and more successful deck lists in that section, just so you have an idea of this is what is doing well at the top of the metagame and so on and so forth. So I'm going to try to include a little bit of that this week, but you know, I know a lot of you out there that watch this really like that, the spice corner, I guess as we'll call it. So we'll keep a little bit of that. Don't you worry, for sure. But we are going to start off as we always do with Modern, and Modern's great. I don't know what else to say. Boros Energy increasing a little bit, went from 16.8 last week to 18.3 this week. So you'll remember a couple weeks ago, it was either 2 or 3 weeks ago, where Boros Energy was finally dethroned as the most popular deck by the Esper Blink deck. And now it's kind of creeping back up a little bit more. Nothing too crazy. This is still within that sort of range that it's been ever since it's been a deck in Modern, ever since MH3. So nothing too scary there. Tron, exactly the same as last week. Bird Scale, slight downtick. Domain Zoo, slight downtick. Grixis Reanimator, downtick. Esper Blink, bit of an uptick there from 5.5 to 8%. One thing I want to highlight here, if you look at on the left-hand side of your screen, Mono Blue Belcher, 3.1 to 8.9, so almost triple its metagame percentage last week. And as you see here, it did take down one of the challenges. Again, makes sense, right? If Boros Energy is increasing in metagame share, one of the best possible decks you could play against Boros Energy is Mono Blue Belcher. And it also happens to do relatively well against the Tron decks, which are basically there's sort of this metagame like shift where Esper Blink is getting more popular to quote unquote be good against Boros Energy. Eldrazi Tron is popping up to be good against Esper Blink, and now Mono Blue Belcher happens to be good against basically all three of those, right? Belcher is good against Tron, Esper Blink, and Boros. Obviously, depending on what sideboard cards they have, things can swing a little bit differently, but that's kind of the metagame evolution, as it were. And then Esper Gorios, again, last week, really not much there. And then this week, 6.7% with a challenge taken down as well. The list that we looked at last week, I was going to show the one that won this week, but we did take a look at it last week and it really wasn't that different. There was maybe like 4 or 5 cards that have changed. They did add the 4th Quantum Riddler, which is not very surprising to me because that card seems to be completely cracked in half. But yeah, Esper Gorios doing pretty well, and that's pretty much it. Everything else is kind of staying around the same. So increase in Boros, Esper, and Mono Blue, and then a slight bit of a downtick in Brute Scale, Domain Zoo, and Reanimator. So with all of that, let us go ahead and see if we can find some spice. And the first deck we are going to take a look at is from Blade Magician. And Blade Magician has shown us this affinity deck list. Now, very, very similar to what people have been doing with the 4 copies of Pinnacle Emissary. You can warp this for 1 mana and then play as many of your zeros as your heart's desire to get a whole bunch of 1/1 drones. If you can also pair that with a Mox Opal, there's some draws that this deck has that involve turn 1 Kappa Cannoneer, which is kind of absurd to me. So you have that kind of whole aspect. You have the zeros, Mox Opals, Mishra's Bauble, so on and so forth. And then the draw 2s like Thought Monitor and Thoughtcast. This deck, instead of playing more Metallic Rebukes and some more zeros and things like that, this version is actually featuring 3 copies of Weapons Manufacturing and 3 copies of Arcbound Ravager. So the concept there is Weapons is very, very powerful when you're playing a pile of 0 mana artifacts, which you kind of want to do anyways for Pinnacle Emissary. So, and then weapons makes a bunch of munitions, and then you can fire the munitions all at once if you have an Arcbound Ravager. The one thing I did notice about this deck list is they decided to omit the Claws of Gix, which is a 0 mana artifact that says you can pay 1 mana to sack a permanent to gain a life. And that card is powerful with weapons because it gives you a card that you can saga for that is a sack outlet. So I would consider playing that. This is the sideboard just kind of for posterity's sake. Galvanic Blast, Force, some more saga targets, and so on and so forth. But all in all, very interesting looking affinity deck from Blade Magician. Next up here from Kian926, we have Dimir Spur. I mean, it's the only white card in the entire main deck is 1 pest control, so I'm still going to call it Dimir for what it's worth. You can get mad at me in the comments, that's okay. But I wanted to highlight this because we saw last week that, and this week as well, the Esper Goryo's deck that's been doing very well, and they're playing 4 copies of Quantum Riddler. Riddler, as I mentioned last week, extremely powerful with Psychic Frog, because Psychic Frog allows you to discard cards to put counters on it. Whenever it hits them, you draw a card. So you can actually just dump your hand with Frog, and then when you hit your opponent with the Frog, you now draw 2 off the Riddler. So it's a way for you to kind of make sure that you can keep flowing cards, and you get a lot more damage out of Frog that way. And guess what the other good Psychic Frog deck is? Just blue-black. The other thing that I really like about this version is the inclusion of Tamiyo Inquisitive Student and Kaido Bane of Nightmares. Tamiyo gives you an extremely cheap flyer to be able to ninjutsu the Kaido regularly, and just having a 3-mana threat that can't be countered and like does kill your opponent relatively quickly while also drawing cards. If you're hellbent, you can activate the Kaido and draw more cards with Riddler. So really interesting take on this sort of blue-black frog tempo style deck. No Murktide Regents. Those have been sort of replaced by Riddlers and Kaidos. But good interaction like Fatal Push, Thoughtseize, counter spells, and just take a quick look at the sideboard. There are more white cards in the sideboard, as you see here. So the white splash does extend a little bit past the 1 pest control, but, you know, very good looking list here from Kian926. All right, you want to talk about Spice. You can't spell Spice without Based Cloy. This list from user Based Cloy and the MTGO Challenge top 32s here. This is an absolute banger of a list. So it's Living End, where the whole concept is you still want to cascade into Living End. Now, you'll notice there are no copies of Shardless Agent or Ardent Plea, so you might ask yourself, well, where's our Cascade spell? The Cascade spell of choice here is Bloodbraid Marauder. It's a 3/1 that can't block, and the spell has Cascade as long as you have Delirium. So you'll notice there's a lot of cards in this deck that have 2 types. Fear of Missing Out, Enduring Courage, Twin Shot Sniper, Overlord of the Baelmerk, so on and so forth. So you do a bunch of self-milling with stuff like Overlord of the Baelmerk and Malevolent Rumble. One thing I will mention, the upside, or basically the reason to play Bloodbraid Marauder, is you get to play 2-mana spells in your deck, because your Cascade spell now is a 2-drop. So now if you go past a Grisly Salvage or a Malevolent Rumble when you're cascading, you're not going to take a look. It's going to skip by those. Normally with Shardless Agent and Ardent Plea, they would hit the 2-drops. So that's kind of the upside there. So we're using Salvage, Rumble, and Overlord as our self-mill. And then the really cool thing about this deck list is if you mill over Enduring Courage, and you Living End back an Enduring Courage and a pile of creatures, they all trigger the Enduring Courage. So they're all going to get +2/+0 in haste, so it kind of gives you the opportunity to just one-shot your opponent. And if you're getting back a Fear of Missing Out, that will not only have haste, but you likely already have Delirium because, well, you cast the Bloodbraid Marauder, so that is kind of sick as well. Twin Shot Sniper is a 2-mana removal spell that is 2 types in the yard that also pings when it comes back into play. That's pretty sick. Street Wraith to cycle. Phantasmagorian, which if you mill over, you can just dump 3 cards from your hand to get it back, and that allows you to get more stuff into the graveyard. Really sweet looking deck list here from Based Cloy, and the username says it all. They are definitely based. And the last deck that I wanted to take a look at here is, you've probably seen this one before. But the reason I wanted to highlight this is, by the way, from user Rostov, who actually won one of the challenges with Boros this weekend. The reason I wanted to highlight this deck is the inclusion of Halia, where I think this card is kind of crazy in the Boros decks, and I'm surprised that more people haven't been trying this. I don't think you want 4 copies because it is legendary, but I could certainly see 3, especially with how well it works with stuff like, I mean, everything. Voice of Victory makes 2 tokens to trigger it to gain you the 3 life. Seasoned Pyromancer, when it enters the battlefield, you discard 2 spells. That's 3 tokens. That's worth a card. Flage gains you 3 life when it comes into play. That's worth a card. Ajani is only 2, but you can probably find 1 more. Guide of Souls and Ocelot Pride. And the really interesting thing about Halia is that it triggers in your end step even if you haven't already gained the 3 life. So for example, if you have a Guide, Pride, and a Halia in play and you've only gained 2 life that turn, you can stack it to where you resolve the Pride first, make the token, gain the 3rd life, and then resolve the Halia trigger. So there's a lot of really cool things you can do with Halia in this deck, and expect to see a lot more copies of this in Boros in the near future. Now that we have taken a look at the modern metagame, let us go ahead and switch over to Pioneer. And Pioneer do be pioneering. That's what I'll say about that. It do be pioneering. So last week, for basically the first time in history, in the past 9 months, somebody had taken over Mono Red Mice as the most popular deck. Well, we're going backwards now. So Mono Red Mice went from 12.5 all the way back up to 21.9%. So it seems like the Mice players just took a weekend off. Well, they're back now. Rakdos Demons from 16.9 to 9.4. Although it did win 2 challenges, and I'm looking at the numbers here. I don't see any Mono Red winners. Mono Black midrange 13.8, last week 10.6. Is It Phoenix 9.4 both weeks. Celestia Angels, bit of a downtick. Azorius Control, nice. Orzhov Monument, a little bit up from last week, 6.3. Boros Hammer, a little bit down from last week, but other than that, nothing too crazy. So the big takeaways here are uptick in Mono Red, downtick in Demons, and slight uptick in Mono Black, slight downtick in Angels, but realistically, not a lot of changes outside of that. And I was only able to find 3 deck lists to show you guys this week. I looked through every single one and I couldn't find anything that was worth showing, but to make up for it, I have an extra one for standard, and you're going to appreciate that. So let's go ahead and take a look at some Pioneer decks. And the first one I want to take a look at is from user Caters21. I believe this was, I think it was a 13th place finish. So this is Enigmatic Incarnation, and for those of you who have not seen this card before, it's sort of like a Birthing Pod-esque type card, where you can sack an enchantment, tutor for a creature with mana value equal to 1+ the sacrificed enchantment's converted mana cost, put that card into play. So, for example, if you sacrifice a 6 mana enchantment, you can go get a 7 mana creature. Now, the reason I wanted to highlight this deck list is it's playing a couple of cards that I had not seen before. This deck list has really removed the red. I know some people were playing red at various points for Overlord of the Boiler Bilges, and I think maybe a couple of other splash cards that they would tutor for off Enigmatic, but this one is more of a clean, really just 3-color splash Zur, which is, Zur, you don't even need to cast Zur, you can just go fetch it out with the Enigmatic. But the new cards here that I haven't seen is Jukai Naturalist, which is a 2-mana 2/2 lifelink that says enchantment spells cost 1 less. So what's nice about this is you have this weird thing where you want some 2-mana creatures to be able to tutor up in the games where you don't have a target for Seam Rip, because you can just run it out on the battlefield and then sack the Seam Rip, even if it has nothing under it, to go get the Jukai. And the nice thing about Jukai is in those games, you can, if you sack Seam Rip, you can go get the Naturalist. Then your future enchantments all cost 1 less mana. So it allows you to maybe set up a double spell turn on the following turn. If you happen to draw one of your expensive cards, that one would cost 1 less. And speaking of expensive cards, Summon Leviathan. This is a 6/6 for 4 blue. It's a saga. The first chapter returns each creature that isn't a Kraken, Leviathan, Merfolk, Octopus, or Serpent. So essentially, just bounce all of your opponent's creatures. And that can be a huge tempo swing. And the other really important fact about Summon Leviathan is that it is an enchantment creature. So for example, if you sacrifice a 5 to go into it, you know, your 5s are your overlords. So you can basically chain an overlord into a Leviathan. And you don't really have any 6-mana enchantments that you, most of the time, that you want to sack. Presumably, you're going to want to keep the binding in play because whatever underneath it is powerful. But you can just sack the Leviathan the next turn to go get your 7-drop, Atraxa or Angel of Serenity. So really cool looking take and some interesting card choices here from Caters21. Next up here from CrusherBot BG. Man, I gotta say, CrusherBot, if you're watching right now, 07s, shout out to CrusherBot. You keep coming up with banger deck list after banger deck list. So this one here is a mono red, I guess we'll call it a mono red weapons manufacturing deck. So basically the idea here is you have weapons paired with a bunch of cheap artifacts. Ornithopter, Rust Harvester, Darksteel Citadel also will trigger it because it triggers on enter, not cast. Experimental Synthesizer, Springleaf Drum, and then Legion Extruder as well as a 2-mana. So you have a good amount of cheap artifacts to make a bunch of weapons. You now also have Ravenous Intruder, which is a card that says sacrifice an artifact, gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So if you have an overabundance of weapons tokens, you can then sacrifice those to Ravenous Intruder. Similar to lists that we saw last week that were playing Torch the Tower and other ways to sack one at a time, but now you can just one-shot them with the Intruder. You can also sack them to stuff like Shrapnel Blast and things like Legion Extruder. But on top of all of that, we're also a Cori-steel Cutter deck because we already have stuff like Ornithopter and Springleaf Drum, so cheap artifacts, and in the case of Drum that make mana, and those happen to work well with Cori-steel Cutter. You're also a Tezzeret deck, so you can search up. I would like to maybe see some more tutor targets for Tez, like Ghost Vacuum, Soul Guide Lantern, things like that, which maybe those are in the sideboard. Yep, okay, so yeah, there we go. CrusherBot has prepared for that. But really cool looking list here from CrusherBot, and would recommend giving this one a try. So I can't remember if it was last week or the week prior that we took a look at a Boros Convoke deck with Cosmogran Zenith, and that list only had, I believe, 2 copies. And this one here from Arcane1 has the full 4 copies. The other thing that I really appreciate about this version is pairing Cosmogran Zenith with Ornithopter. It's so subtle, but basically Ornithopter, as weird as this sounds, it kind of does everything. Where it's a 0-mana creature, so it effectively gives you +1 mana on the turn that you're trying to cast your Convoke card. It is a 0-mana artifact that sets you up for turn 1 Gleeful Demolition. It's a 0-mana creature that you can put into play to put a counter on Warden, and it's a 0-mana spell that lets you trigger Cosmogran Zenith on turn 3. So you can go, if you have one other creature in play, you can go turn 3, Zenith, play Thopter, make tokens, now you have 5 bodies, set up a Convoke card. So a lot of cool stuff that this Cosmogran Zenith Ornithopter package does. And I gotta say, if I ever play Boros Convoke and Pioneer again, I'm gonna have to give this list a try. All right, now that we've taken a look at Pioneer, let us go ahead and switch over to Standard. And this is where we are. So if you take a look at this guy, every time I look at it, I have to laugh. I can't help myself. So looking at the metagame, there is a Cauldron at 31.8%, Dimir midrange at 23.4%, and Mono Red at 20%. For those of you mathing at home, that is 75% of the entire format is 3 decks. Which just, I mean, that's rock, paper, scissors, right? Red beats Cauldron, Cauldron beats Dimir, Dimir beats Red. So I guess this is, in terms of rock, paper, scissors, about as cookie cutter as you'll ever get. But, I mean, there's basically no other playable decks here, right? Azorius Control, Boros Mice, is it Prowess, I guess, maybe? Mono Black, Orzhov Tokens, Jeskai Pixie. I mean, literally, the entire wheel has been so, supplanted by these 3 decks that I don't even have room to include most of these, these ones in the middle. There's just no room on the chart. And yeah, the winners of the challenges were, big shocker, 6, 2 Dimir, 2 Cauldron, 2 Mono Red. So yeah. Now I will say, we're going to take a look at some deck lists here. I'm going to show you the Mono Red deck just for posterity's sake. Obviously it's not Spice, but there was some interesting decks to take a look at over the weekend. So let's do that. And the first one that I want to show you guys here is from Hamuda. And Hamuda is a name that, if you've been following Magic Online results over quite a while now at this point, you might recognize that name. Hamuda plays a ton of MTGO, and they have decided to bring this blue-white, I have it labeled as blue-white Convoke, just because Warden sort of is Convoke adjacent, But basically, this is just like blue-white mid-range. And the idea is you have a bunch of cheap cards that put multiple permanents into play. 4 Novice Inspector and 4 Spyglass Siren. Those pair very well with Warden of the Inner Sky, because they make 2 permanents that you can tap to the Warden and let you activate it a lot faster multiple times. Also, it turns out these cards make artifacts. And what triggers off of artifacts? Halia. Because Halia says whenever it or another creature or artifact enters, you gain a life. So there is some really cool lines where you can go like Warp Halia, then play a Spyglass, gain 2 more life, tap those 3 to the Warden, end step trigger the Halia, so on and so forth. 4 Starfield Shepherd make an appearance here, and this seems like a lot, but I do like this card quite a bit, especially when combined with Nurturing Pixie, because on turn 3, when you have 3 mana, you can warp the Shepherd for 2, go find Pixie to pick up the Shepherd. That's going to gain you 2 life if you have a Holly in play, and then you can just do it all again next turn because the Shepherd is in your hand and not in exile. I mean, just playing some good cards like Flood Pit's Drowner. Voice of Victory is very powerful with Halia because it triggers off of the tokens entering the battlefield. And then some removal spells, only a couple of frigates. It's hard to find room for more copies. But I will say, this list looks really, really clean. Very well thought out. A lot of interesting decisions and card choices, but I think they all make a ton of sense in this one. Next up, we have a bit of a wild one. So this is from user King Harry, who I believe got 13th place in one of the challenges this weekend. I actually think they put up 2 results. I think they were both top 32s. And this list looks, I don't know how else to say it other than wild. So this is Jeskai Pixie, where you're utilizing, well, there's actually only Nurturing Pixie. There's no Sun Pearl Karens or anything like that. There is 1 copy of Get Out to be able to bounce, but that's sort of the main idea. Is like you're playing enchantments that have good enter the battlefield. There's a mirror room that you can make a copy of a creature and then pick up the mirror room to sort of go infinite with something like Nurturing Pixie. But you need a lot of mana for that. The Roaring Furnace, you can pick up the removal spell over and over again. Rediscover the Way is a cool one because it sort of acts like a stock up that you can just keep rebuying with something like Nurturing Pixie. And then in the case of Rediscover the Way, very, very powerful with this card that I'm curious of how many people watching this have ever seen Ghostly Dancers before. This is a 5 mana 2/5 flyer. When it enters, you can return an enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand or unlock a room. And then whenever an enchantment enters and whenever you unlock a room, you make a 3/1 flyer. So when your Rediscover the Way goes to the graveyard naturally on turn 5, because you play it on 3, chapter 2 on turn 4, chapter 3 on turn 5, you can then just Dancers it right back to your hand, turn after, play the enchantment, make a 3/1 flyer, kind of go from there. This has a lot of control elements where counter spells, stock ups, Day of Judgment. So it is more of a control deck than sort of an aggressive or mid-range deck, but there's probably other ways to just utilize the rest of these spots and maybe trim some of these for more Pixies, Sun Pearl Kirans, more Storm Chasers talents. You could probably make this more of an aggressive deck that tops off the curve at Dancers, but really interesting take on the Pixie archetype, and shout out to King Harry. All right, we're not going to spend more than 10 seconds on this. I just wanted to show you what Mono Red looked like, and also the fact that they are now main decking 4 copies of Razorkin Needlehead, which says whenever an opponent draws a card, it deals 1 damage to them, and 4 copies of Scalding Viper. Whenever an opponent casts a spell with mana value 3 or less, deals 1 damage to them. So this is Mono Red. There, next. Poseidon, shout out for the list. Next deck. Now, this one, on the other hand, we are going to spend a little bit more time on. So, for those of you who don't know, the Spotlight Series in Orlando took place this past weekend. And yes, there was 21 Cauldron decks in the top 32. Yes, it was 54% of the day 2 metagame. But what if I told you there was one brave soul out there named Haoshin Wong who made top 32 of this event, 15 rounds of Swiss. I believe they finished with a record of 11-4. It may have been 10, 4, and 1. I don't recall. And they played Temur Battlecrier. Now, Temur Battlecrier is a deck that we have spent a lot of time on. Other content creators have been playing a ton of it. But this particular list really, really stands out to me. So the new inclusion here is Doc Orlock Grizzled Genius. So this is blue and a green for a 2/3 that says spells you cast from your graveyard or exile cost 2 less, and plotting cards from your hand also costs 2 less. So in the instance of Outcaster Trailblazer, plot it for 1 mana. Nova Hellkite, you can warp it for 3 and then also cast it for 3 because it costs 2 less from exile. You can plot Brawler for 2 mana, 2 mana, not 4 mana, 2 mana. You can also flashback Winternight Stories for 2 less mana. So in the case of Doc, you can use the Doc to harmonize it, which would already discount it by 2, and then the Doc also discounts it another 2, so it just lets you flashback stories for a single mana. And the main kill condition, you'll notice there's no, there's no Roaming Thrones, there's no Vestige, there's no Dragonhawk, there's no Immodanes. The only win condition in this deck, well, besides attacking people with a bunch of 4-power creatures, is the combo of Railway Brawler and Devastating Onslaught, which is also, again, really sick because your main combo piece works so well with Doc Orlock. I would like to maybe see some more warp cards, like more Hellkites, Quantum Riddlers, to be able to pair with the Doc Orlock, but this is a really, really innovative take on the Temur Battlecryer deck. Show the sideboard here just for posterity's sake. And yeah, big shout out to Haoshin Wong for doing so well with this Battlecryer deck. Absolute banger of a deck list. And we are going to end the week off with Mardu cards? Okay, so hold the L. That is the username. I'm not telling you to hold the L. That is the username of the MTGO individual who played this deck list in a challenge. I guess we can call it Mardu Artist Talent or Mardu Monument. That is sort of the main synergy here, is Artist Talent says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you can discard a card to draw a card, and then Monument, whenever you discard a card, you get to do one of 3 things, but you can only do once each turn. The interesting thing is that if you pair Artist Talent with a bunch of instants, you can then trigger talent on your opponent's turn. Therefore, you can get one of each of these, draw a card, make a treasure, each opponent loses 3 life, on each individual turn. So you can do one of each on your turn and one of each on your opponent's turn. So pairing that in a Mardu shell, because this is Inevitable Defeat, one of the best removal spells in the format because it just kills everything. And the Cauldron deck presents you with a lot of permanents that have different types, artifacts, enchantments, creatures, and you have to kill all of them. So having a good catch-all removal spell, it's a little expensive, 4 mana. And then the rest of this is just kind of some control elements, right? You have a bunch of removal spells, you have wraths, different wraths, early interaction, removal, couple of planeswalkers, and then 4 Fear of Missing Out, which looks a little strange, but the Fear of Missing Out allowing you to trigger Monument and also getting you extra combat steps with stuff like Tursa, maybe throw a Beza in the mix. So really interesting sort of take on the control shell. Look at this, got some Cauldron hate in the board, but really different take on the control shell and one that maybe is potentially good. We'll see. And that, my friends, is going to do it for another episode of Watching the Metagame. I really hope you guys enjoyed this week. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, adios.